Hello, everybody. We're going to start in a moment or two. We're just giving people time to get let in from the waiting room, and we'll start in probably 30 seconds or so. Thank you all for joining. Okay, shall we start, Helene?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay. So, welcome everybody to what is the third and final event of this year's Jewish Literacy Initiative, which is a new committee of Westchester Jewish Council designed to enhance Jewish literacy in our Westchester community. I am Jonathan Flaxer, chair of the committee. We've had two prior programs. I know many of you participated in those. And in them, we have started in the period of the sages of the Mishnah in a wonderful program led by Professor Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University. We then jumped ahead about 2,000 years and examined the period of the Enlightenment led by Professor Ellie Stern of Yale University. Both of those presentations, as well as this one tonight, are being recorded, have been recorded, and will be available on the wjcouncil.org website. Looking ahead real quick, we are planning a series of programs on Jewish music in the fall in conjunction with SUNY Purchase Jewish Studies Department. Tonight, our topic is the modern state of Israel, and our program is called Israel, the Dream of 1967 and the Reality of 2023. In so doing, we are really thrilled to have with us Yossi Klein Halevi, who, as many of you know, is in great demand these days, so we're very lucky to have him. By way of brief introduction, Mr. Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. There, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. His 2013 book, which is the focus of our talk tonight, is Like Dreamers, which won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His latest book, called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a bestseller and has appeared in 12 languages. His recent op-eds, open letters, and panel presentations have been a really meaningful and important source of understanding and comprehension of things happening in Israel for Jewish communities across the globe. And I think in part because of these reasons, we have over 375 people signed up for tonight. I want to give special thanks to our co-sponsors, UJA Federation of New York, Bet Am Shalom Synagogue, Congregation Kol Ami, Hebrew Institute of White Plains, Jewish Education Project, Temple Israel Center of White Plains, the Westchester Board of Rabbis, and the Westchester Association of Temple Educators. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the presentation. This will be done only via chat. And what you do with your questions is you send them to Elizabeth Lampert, who you'll see listed in the list of people participating. She is a member of the Jewish Literacy Initiative Committee, and she will then pose the questions to Mr. Halevi. And to avoid distractions, the audience will be on mute. I want to lastly note that Westchester Jewish Council is the umbrella organization for 129 Jewish organizations, schools, and synagogues, which serve the 150,000 large Jewish community of Westchester County. I turn it over to Yossi.
Well, thanks very much, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone, and very grateful to all of you for being here and to the council for sponsoring. And special shout out to my old high school friend, Alan Septimus, who initiated this connection, and really wonderful to be with you, Alan. So there's something unbearably painful about juxtaposing 1967 to 2023 for obvious reasons. 1967 was the pinnacle of Jewish unity. 2023 is really the low point. I mean, not since the Rabin assassination have we been as divided. And there is a real and growing fear of violence in the streets, of political violence. And despite the negotiations that are happening now under President Herzog's auspices, very few of us, certainly those of us who have been out on the streets on a weekly basis demonstrating, hold much stock in the talks, and don't believe that this government is negotiating in good faith. But before we get to 2023, I would really like to linger a little bit and savor 1967. And to do so really through the prism of the book that I wrote about the paratroopers of 67, like Dreamers. I understand that some of you will have read the book, others have not. So I'll try to offer those of you who haven't read it some brief summary without imposing on too much on those of you who already have read it. The book, briefly, is the story of 7 paratroopers who fought in Jerusalem in 1967. It focuses on this band of Israeli brothers who went on to fight together in an additional 3 wars. They fought in the nearly forgotten War of Attrition of 1969-1970, Yom Kippur War, and Lebanon was their last war together. And one part of this group of 7 friends turned to the left. The other part of this group turned to the settlement movement. In fact, were among the founders and leaders of the settlement movement. And the book tells the story of post-1967 Israel through these 7 entwined lives. These are people who continue to have a great deal to do with each other, even as they became increasingly prominent in various fields, political, artistic, economic, social fields, that helped shape the Israel as we know it today. The book took 11 years to write. It's based on hundreds of interviews. And I'll have more to say a little bit later about why it took so long to write, because that is very much part of the story the backstory that I want to share with you. The book is written through the perspectives of each of the characters. When the book is focusing, for example, on one of the settler leaders, the perspective of the book becomes right-wing. When it shifts to one of the left-wing characters, you see that same event through the perspective of the left. And the book is intentionally disorienting. it goes in and out of these opposing perspectives in order to invite the reader to experience the inner workings of the Israeli dichotomy, the conflicting states of consciousness of these characters. And to some extent, the style of the book is actually the point of the book, which is to disorient the reader to the point where you start not only understanding the different characters and the different conflicting perspectives, but you find yourself reluctantly identifying with the camp that you are opposed to. Whether you're from the right or the left, you find yourself being pulled into the inner life of the other camp. And the most gratifying responses that I received to Like Dreamers were from people who said to me, either on the right or the left, you know, I never understood what they were talking about, that other camp. How could you possibly think that way? Don't you understand what's so obvious to me? Why isn't it obvious to you? And after reading this book, not that I, God forbid, agree with the other camp, but I've begun to understand and to internalize something of the perspective of the other. The motivation for writing this book was to explore the schisms that have divided the Jewish people since the Six-Day War, and really in some ways are culminating at this time. Of course, when the book was published in 2013, I had no idea that things would get anywhere near to this low point in our internal relations. But the book really was intended to try to understand something of these 50 years of post-1967 Israel and how we got to the different stages of contemporary Israeli history. The enduring dream of 1967 and the increasingly elusive dream of 1967 is the unity of the Jewish people. And not a euphoric unity, not the unity that could really only last 6 days because it was such an intensive experience of unity, or maybe lasting through the summer of 67. But that level of euphoric unity can't possibly last. But to at least be able to preserve something of the spirit of 67, in which that which unites us is stronger than that which divides us. And I can't say that about Israel today. I can't say that what unites us in Israel today is stronger than what divides us. We don't know. We haven't been put to the ultimate test yet. And the way it feels now, the forces that are tearing us apart are prevailing. But the dream of 1967, the experience of 1967, was that we were never as united as we were from those weeks beginning before the war in May 1967, those 2 or 3 weeks before the war, what we call in Israel the waiting period, Tkufat HaHamtana, the period of waiting before the outbreak of war, through the war itself, and then into the summer of 67. And when I think back to that period, what's so extraordinary is that Jews around the world, no matter where we lived, no matter what our politics or religious or non-religious identity, almost all Jews then were united in this kind of emotional trajectory that began with this sense of existential fear in May 1967, gave way to relief in the first few days of the war when we realized the extent of the victory. It gave way to euphoria when we saw that we were conquering on three fronts, and finally gave way to awe when we vicariously stood with the paratroopers at the wall on the morning of June 7th, 1967. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that not since we stood together at Sinai were we as united as a people as we were in 1967. And to my mind, and I'm speaking now as a religious Jew, I don't believe it was a coincidence that a few days after the return to Jerusalem, we celebrated the festival of Shavuot, which of course is the festival of Sinai. And that was really the direct link between the experience of 1967 and our founding as a people 3,500 years before in an act of unifying divine revelation. And my father, who was a Holocaust survivor, said to me I had just turned 14 during the war. And he said to me that when we are united as a people, no force in the world can stop us. It's when we're divided that we become vulnerable. And what he really emphasized to me when I was growing up was the deep disunity of the Jewish people in pre-Holocaust Europe, how Jews were bitterly divided ideologically, religiously, and this he saw really as one of the sources of our fatal weakness that made us so vulnerable in the Shoah. And he saw the unity of 1967 as this tikkun, the Jewish people's belated response to the debilitating consequences of disunity. That summer, in the summer of 1967, my father and I spent in Israel, and he hadn't seen, his two brothers had survived the war, he hadn't seen them. And so it was a reunion in multiple ways. It was the summer of the happy ending of Jewish history, or so we thought. That summer, Israelis were convinced that it's over. We won. Not only did we win that particular war, but we were the victors of Jewish history. And certainly the Arab nations would never challenge us again. Peace was imminent. Everyone now understood that Israel was invincible and that the Jewish people were the great victors in their own story. And that sense of triumph and almost a kind of an arrogant invincibility. And I say arrogant with a measure of understanding of our psyche in those years, in those days. Because really, if you think about the dizzying proximity between the end of the Shoah and the Six-Day War, within 2 decades, we went from the lowest point in our history in terms of our powerlessness to the peak point of Jewish power in all of Jewish history, including the Davidic kingdom. We were never as powerful as we were on the 7th day of the Six-Day War. And so there was something deeply disorienting, psychologically almost unhinging about the almost immediate transition from powerlessness to power. And as a result of that, I think that we didn't know how to absorb the power. I came back to Brooklyn after the summer of 1967 wearing a bullet around my neck because that's what teenage Israeli boys in the summer of 67 were wearing. They were selling bullets in all the kiosks in Israel. You bought a bullet on a chain, a bullet that a Soviet bullet, part of the spoils of war, and I came back to Brooklyn wearing a bullet, and so this sense of power, of invulnerability, was really a reaction, perhaps an understandable overreaction to the acute vulnerability which Jews of my generation grew up experiencing. I certainly felt it most acutely growing up in a survivor home, but I think it was true for the whole generation. It was true for American Jewry. And the way in which American Jews responded to the Six-Day War was also part of that overcompensation. It wasn't just relief. It was this sense of now we don't have to be ashamed of being powerless anymore. And the image, those of you who are my contemporaries will remember that the most popular image among American Jews in the summer of 67 was a poster of a chassid in a phone book changing into a Superman costume. Instead of an S, he had a shin on his chest. In my doctor's office in Flatbush, there was a floor-to-ceiling poster of Moshe Dayan, the defense minister. And what was even more extraordinary than a doctor putting a giant poster of a general in his waiting room was the fact that nobody thought that was unusual in 1967. That was the spirit among American Jews. That was the spirit in the diaspora. The Six-Day War changed Soviet Jewry. The rise of the refuseniks begins literally the day after the Six-Day War. The first uprising begins with the Six-Day War in the Soviet Union, so that the Jewish people that we know today, the self-confident American Jewish community, the resurgence, the Jewish rebirth of Soviet Jewry, the centrality of Israel, it all begins with 1967. The dark side of the legacy of 67 is that it was, and really the great irony of 67 is that precisely the event that most united us was also, can you all hear me? There's a very strong rain coming behind me. You don't hear the rain? We're good? Okay, great. Because I can hardly hear myself. It's this very, okay. So the great irony here is that the event that was our most unifying experience was also the long-term consequences were in fact to divide us. And I'm thinking, of course, about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, occupied territory, liberated territory. We can't even agree on how to call it. So I just prefer calling it the territories. And the impossible dilemma that we face today, which is what we inherited from 1967, was what do we do with the territories? If we annex them, we spare ourselves the security threat of a Palestinian state on our most sensitive border, but we internalize, we absorb millions of Palestinians into our society, and we effectively destroy our ability to remain a Jewish and democratic state. If we create a Palestinian state, we risk a second Gaza 5 minutes away from Tel Aviv. And so the curse of 1967 is what we're living through today, the sense of being trapped by the fruits of victory. And this is really part of the irony of the long-term consequence of 1967. Now, I wrote this book. I wrote Like Dreamers because my Israeli life has really been framed by two seminal events. The first, of course, was 1967, and that was the moment, being in Israel that summer, I knew that I was going to make Aliyah. In fact, I told my father, he can go home, back to Brooklyn. I'm staying in Israel. I'll go to high school here. It'll all work out just fine. You can imagine what his reaction was. And I finally made it back as an immigrant to Israel in the summer, the fateful summer of 1982, which was the beginning of the first Lebanon War. And that summer was really the antithesis of the summer of 1967. If the summer of 67 was the peak experience of Jewish unity, the summer of 1982 was the moment when war not only failed to unite us, but was itself the pretext for tearing us apart. And so I joined a society that was so deeply divided against itself, and the reason, the trigger for that division was what had always united us in the past, which was an external threat. And this book was clearly percolating in me for many years. And when I finally began writing in the early 2000s, it was another seminal moment in Israeli history. It was at the peak of the Second Intifada, which was a moment when, with the 4 years of suicide bombings, when we felt, at least initially, that Israeli society was unraveling, that we weren't able to contend with the most concerted terror assault against Israel in our history. And so these were the elements that were at play when I started writing the book. And the sensibility of the book is very much a centrist, politically centrist viewpoint. And I became a centrist as a result of making Aliyah in the summer of 1982 and seeing Israel tearing itself apart. And my great fear as an immigrant of 1982 was that we were losing the most minimal ability to hold together, which was, of course, the great achievement of 1967. And I wrote this book to try to, in a way, retrieve something of the spirit of 1967 by helping us understand each other through the heroes who gave us our greatest victory. And I felt that if I could write a book about left-wingers and right-wingers who were paratroopers together in 67, it would allow Jews from across the political spectrum to enter into the other camp's mindset. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this book took me 11 years to write. And the reason for that, I think there were several reasons. One of them was that I didn't hear the voice of the book while I was writing it. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Every book has a voice, a distinct voice. Readers may not be able to explicitly identify that voice, but they resonate with the voice. They are, if you connect to a book, you intuitively understand the voice. For a writer, not to explicitly hear the voice of your own book is a kind of a literary, it's a kind of a literary paralysis. And it's the book for me it had no coherent voice. all I heard was left versus right, this one arguing with that one, going in this one's head and then that one's head. And it sounded to me like a cacophony that had no connecting thread. And this went on for years, and it made it impossible for me to finish the book. And one day I had this kind of revelation. I don't know how else to call it, a writer's equivalent of a revelation about your own book, which is that the cacophony, what I was interpreting as cacophony, is in fact the voice of the book. It is Israel arguing with itself, because that was my Israeli voice. What I learned as an immigrant through the 1980s and 90s was to listen carefully to the arguments of the left and the arguments of the right. And I realized that the left was right, that we can't annex the territories, we can't be permanent occupiers, and that the right was right, that we can't make peace with the Palestinian national movement so long as it doesn't recognize our right to exist. And so the result, the combined result of internalizing the truth of the left and the truth of the right was that I came out a centrist, a little bit left-wing, a little bit right-wing. And it was a very lonely position in those years. Today, it's much less of a lonely position, because since the Second Intifada, Israeli society is no longer divided between right and left. There's virtually no left in Israel anymore. It's now the right versus the center. Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, Benny Gantz's blue and white party. It's the center versus the right. And so this book was really an attempt to explain in a literary form my own personal transformation into the kind of Israeli who could hear the arguments of the left and the arguments of the right. So let me fast forward now to 2023, because something fundamentally changed for me as a centrist this year, as it did, I think, for many centrists. This is the year that I stopped being capable of saying both sides have essential insights and let's listen to both arguments. Because what became clear to me, and very, very large numbers of other Israelis, especially from the center, is that this is not, what we are facing in Israel today is not a question of two sides. Now, of course, there are two sides of the issue of how to proceed with judicial reform. There is an important conservative perspective, there's an important liberal perspective, but that's not really what's being played out in Israel today. What's being played out is you have a government that I regard as morally illegitimate, a government that is the meeting point of corrupt politicians, far-right political extremists, and religious fundamentalists, against those of us who are in the streets week after week, trying to save Israeli democracy. And I would go further, trying to save Israeli decency. And so something really shifted for me this year. And I have been in an acute oppositional mode to my own government, which I have never been in the 40 years that I've lived in Israel. I've never experienced this. I've always taken it for granted that there are left-wing governments, right-wing governments, centrist governments. They're all legitimate. They're all democratically elected. This government is certainly legally legitimate, but it isn't, from my perspective, it lacks moral legitimacy. To be a liberal in Israel today is to experience a level of anguish that I've never experienced in all these decades of living in Israel. And that's really saying a lot, because what has happened over the last 40 years has been wars and endless terrorist attacks, missile attacks on our cities. Nothing for me has compared to the anxiety and the anger that I'm experiencing over these last months. What was inconceivable only a half a year ago has become the norm today. And in many ways, I feel that we're living in a kind of inverse reality, a surreal reality in Israel. We have a prime minister on trial who is trying to enact the most far-reaching transformation of the judicial system that is trying him for corruption, and he is arrogating for himself the right to manipulate the judicial system. This government has turned the Supreme Court, which Alan Dershowitz, who is no left-winger, has called the jewel in the crown of Israel, turning the Supreme Court into an enemy of the state. Just the other day, one of our two justice ministers, this government in its wisdom has appointed no less than two justice ministers. One of the justice ministers, Dudi Amsalem, has called for putting on trial Esther Hayut, who is the head of the she is the Supreme Court Chief Justice. So we have a justice minister calling for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to be put on trial. We have Ben Gvir, a Kahanist, whom the IDF wouldn't draft when he was 18 because he was considered too dangerous to be entrusted with a weapon. This same Ben Gvir is now in charge of the Israeli police. And Netanyahu has just given him what is effectively his own private militia. This government is the most militantly nationalist, politically extreme government we've ever had. It is also the government that is headed by men with the least amount of military experience, which is astonishing. If you look in the aggregate, the heads of the parties in this government, most of them, with the exception of the Likud, either did not serve at all in the army or served minimally. And yet this is the most politically extreme government. This government of men who did not serve in the army is denouncing those of us who are out in the streets who've served in the army. You have pilots, you have commandos, you have graduates of the most elite units who are leading these demonstrations, and government ministers who didn't serve in the army denouncing them as anarchists, denouncing them as traitors. So this is a surreal reality that we're living in Israel today. At the same time, these last months have been the most exhilarating experience that I've ever had as an Israeli. Being out in the streets week after week with hundreds of thousands of people, seeing the demonstrations grow. I was at the first big demonstration in Tel Aviv about 3 months ago. Some of you may recall there was a demonstration that took place in the pouring rain. I was drenched to my bones with an umbrella, and there were fantastic scenes of tens of thousands of umbrellas, and it didn't succeed in keeping us dry. And being there, and that sense of no one is moving, and realizing we're going to win because we are immovable. The same determination that Israelis applied in war against external enemies, we are applying to this threat, this internal threat to Israeli democracy. And there was this exhilarating sense of you're standing among people who are experiencing exactly the same mix of fear for Israel, of anger, and of determination. The slogan on the streets is one word, busha. Busha means disgrace. And that's what people are chanting. That's what we've been chanting week after week. And sometimes, I'll find myself in a crowd and the person next to me will just be so overcome that they'll just start shouting just on their own, busha, busha, it's a, how dare you? How can you do this to Israel? And then everyone around will start picking up on the chant, busha, busha, busha. And there's this sense not only of anger, of rage. The rage is profound, but it's deeper than rage. It's love. And what you feel on the streets is this outpouring of love and fear for the future of Israel. The symbol of the demonstrations is the Israeli flag. I'm sure you've all seen the images, tens of thousands of giant Israeli flags. Now think about that for a moment. There's no opposition like this anywhere in the world. In the US, my understanding is that the flag has basically been appropriated by one side of the street, and that's the right wing. I don't think you'll see thousands of American flags anymore at left-wing demonstrations. And I think that's a tragedy for American society. The good news about Israel is the flag belongs to all of us. We have reclaimed the flag, and we will not allow this government to deny us our pride in the flag. And what we're fighting for is our right to continue to wave the flag and to be proud of the flag. The demonstrations are growing from week to week, becoming more and more broad-based. In Tel Aviv, they're overwhelmingly secular. In Jerusalem, they're at least half religious. In recent weeks, we've seen demonstrations happening in the West Bank settlement of Efrat. It's not a big demonstration, it's just a few hundred people, but symbolically that's crucial because it undercuts the government's attempt to paint us all as leftists. And this is a popular uprising that cuts across the spectrum. I'll end, if I can just take another 3 or 4 minutes to wrap up. What can heal Israeli society? What's going to heal us? How can we retrieve something of the lost spirit of 1967, which I believe is still part of the Israeli DNA? First of all, Netanyahu has to go. There is not going to be any healing so long as he is prime minister, because my half of the country, and we're no longer just half, according to the polls, Netanyahu is hemorrhaging support. He's lost almost 20 seats. There has never been, that I can think of in the history of Israeli politics, a hemorrhaging like we've experienced in the last 4 months, where a sitting government loses almost a third of its support. And so Netanyahu must go. Once he leaves, we'll discover that the differences among mainstream Israelis, whether you're center-left, center-center, as I define myself, or center-right, are really not that substantive. And we all agree that Israel needs to be a Jewish state and a democratic state. We disagree about ways in which that's expressed, but certainly most Israelis want Israel to continue as a democratic and Jewish state. The good news about this period, this terrible period, the silver lining, is, I would say, twofold. First of all, it has activated the center, it has galvanized the center, and it's transformed the center from a kind of amorphous mood into a clear ideology. The center is that place that is militantly affirming Israel as a Jewish and democratic state in a liberal understanding of both of those words. What we mean by a Jewish state, which is as broad a Jewish state, not just the state of Judaism, and certainly not just the state of Orthodox Judaism, the state of the entire Jewish people, whoever we are and however we identify ourselves. And in terms of democracy, we in the center uphold the liberal democratic notion that democracy is a delicate dance between the rights of a majority and the rights of a minority. It is not a crude winner-take-all system, which is what this government is trying to sell us as democratic legitimacy. It is instead a much more complex system. And the second piece of good news here is that we are now finally dealing with long-term distortions in the Israeli system, in Israeli society and Israeli politics. And I'm thinking in particular of the state within a state that the ultra-Orthodox have been allowed to create and that we have been funding all these years. And secondly, settler violence, like we saw in Hawara, the shameful pogrom of a few weeks ago. And these two issues are now also part of the protest movement. It's the rise of Ben Gvir, which is forcing us to recognize that settler violence is not a fringe phenomenon. It's now sitting in the heart. The patrons of the violent settlers are sitting in the heart of government, Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And so what began as a protest movement to save the judiciary, and that's still the main focus of the movement, has broadened in the conversations that we have among ourselves. If you listen to the speeches at the demonstrations, they're beginning to broaden the agenda. And we're beginning to look at what is structurally wrong with Israel. And we're looking at long-term changes that we need to make. I believe that nothing is ever going to be the same again. This moment is a turning point, and I believe it's going to be a turning point as painful and traumatic as the coming months are going to be in Israel, and they really will be, I believe, deeply, deeply difficult. In the long term, I think we will look back at this moment and see this was the moment when liberal Israel reasserted itself and reassumed control of the country and saved Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So let's open for conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. This is really informative and very, very thought-provoking. And we have a lot of questions now. So I think I will start with, how do you help the younger generation understand all of this?
It's a great question. It's really a great question. I'm working on a book now, which is attempting in a way to do that. It's not explicitly aimed at young Jews, but it really is. And it's an attempt by a 20th century Jew, which is how I define myself, to explain what the mid to late 20th century was in Jewish history and what its relevance is for the 21st century Jewish people. And God willing, the book will be completed sometime. I mean, as you've heard, I'm a slow writer. It is coming along, and once it comes out, I think we can revisit that question and ask whether I succeeded or not. I feel my limitations as a 20th century Jew. I feel that I don't have the patience certainly for the progressive discourse of the 21st century. It's so much not my language. It's not my sensibility, both as a 20th century American Jew and as a 21st century Israeli. It's not, I don't understand that language. It doesn't, I don't know how to speak it. And so I don't know. I don't know whether I'll be able to. You know, the last book that I wrote, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was also an attempt to, well, I had two audiences in mind with that book. The first were my Palestinian neighbors and the Muslim world generally, and it was an attempt to explain Zionism to Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims. And the second audience was really young American Jews. And I was hoping that a book addressed to Palestinians would some young American Jews. And that is what happened. The book really reached many, many young American Jews, and the responses were good. And so that gave me the confidence or the foolish assumption that I can then proceed to write a book to more directly address young American Jews.
Thank you. I apologize. I don't know why my camera disappeared, but I am not able to get back on the screen, but hopefully you can hear me. So we have several questions having to do with the government. Do you have ideas for removing Bibi or causing the government to fall? And why weren't these issues discussed and debated during the campaign? You know, why are they coming to a head now?
Well, that's one of the arguments that the opposition is making, is that there was something deeply disingenuous about the campaign that Netanyahu waged. Whenever he was asked during the campaign about his future government's judicial plans, he was always very reassuring, say we're going to move cautiously, consensus is very important. He didn't give us any idea that what he was really going for was not judicial reform, which is what they're still calling this thing, but judicial revolution, upheaval. And so there is a sense, some of his voters, not enough, but some felt betrayed. In the end, what is turning large numbers of his voters away from government is their sheer incompetence. This is not only the most extreme government in Israel's history, it is also by far the most incompetent, the least able to effectively govern. I mentioned that there are two justice ministers because Netanyahu needed to hand out spoils to his loyalists. There are also effectively two defense ministers. And this, I think, might give us some indication of an answer to the first part of your question, which is what can bring this government down is its internal lack of cohesion. It's a government of even though ideologically, this is the most homogeneous coalition in Israel's history. You know, Israeli coalitions are always a bit of a hodgepodge ideologically, which is a very healthy thing because there's a kind of internal checks and balance against a government becoming too extreme. This government has no internal checks and balances. It's either very right-wing or fanatically right-wing. That's the range, the ideological range here. But what is by no means homogeneous are the players here. There is constant jostling for power, for honor. It's a government of scoundrels. That's the only way I can put this. And I think that this is going to, in the end, this will be their undoing.
And do you see a compromise on judicial reform as even being possible? I
think in principle, there are all kinds of interesting compromises that have put been put on the table. President Herzog has put I think, I don't like it, but I can live with it. But this government is really going for broke. It's not going to, it realized that it can't go for broke immediately. The big misperception of the government was to underestimate the capacity of ordinary Israelis for outrage and to sustain our outrage. They thought we would get tired. No one is going anywhere. We are here to stay until the future of Israeli democracy is ensured. So the government is now tactically retreated. It's been forced to retreat. And it is going to proceed incrementally. In off-the-record conversations that were leaked, Likud leaders reassured the faithful that the judicial revolution is going to happen. We're going to do it in stages. The salami, what Israelis call salami tactics. You slice it. And we're not going to allow it to happen because we have absolutely no trust in the goodwill of Netanyahu for sure, but for that matter of almost anyone in this government.
Thank you. Somebody also says that in the last few years, no other government has survived really. And so what makes this one so different? What other than the different issues?
What makes it different really, again, is its ideological cohesiveness. There's never been a more ideologically cohesive government than this. And that is, in principle, its strength. It makes it again, on paper, almost invincible. But I think that Ben Gvir is already threatening to quit the government, and he said, I'll support the government from outside. But the moment people start breaking away from the government, it's the beginning of the end. We know that from precedent. And so I think that it's the extreme personalities at play. It's the combination of extremist purist ideology, which can't tolerate Netanyahu's compromises, along with the tensions, the personality tensions, the greed for power that I think is going to tear this government apart. If I could just say, just to greet one friend who I've just noticed, Marty Crossell here on the screen. Marty, it's so great to see you. So sending you a big embrace.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, I'm afraid you're muted, Marty. We'll have to email afterwards.
So of course, because we are American Jews, there's a lot of questions about what we can do. How can we support Israel while putting pressure on Netanyahu? For example, a lot of people have been talking about cashing in their Israeli bonds. Is there a way that American Jewry or Israel-focused charities or American rabbis can help? And what can we do?
So first of all, just as a general principle, American Jews not only have the right to get involved in Israel's domestic issues, I believe you have the responsibility. If Israel calls itself the nation state of the Jewish people, that comes not only with privileges, not only what we get from the diaspora, but also what we give to the diaspora. And part of what we need to give to you is a place at the table. That doesn't mean that we're always going to listen to diaspora criticism. It doesn't mean that diaspora criticism, for example, on security issues is something that is always wise. Israelis certainly understand the security issues better. We live it. We live with the consequences. But on an issue that's so fundamental for the Israeli diaspora relationship, which is the nature of Israeli identity, the quality of Israeli democracy, you must be part of this debate. This will impact our relationship. It will impact whether your children will feel that they have a place in the Zionist story. If Israel, God forbid, turns anti-democratic, we will lose, certainly, definitively, a majority of American Jewry. This is your issue too. So that's a question of, that's just the principle of it. In practice, I would love to see, I mean, can I just go wild here of what I'd like to see?
Please.
I would love to see American synagogues and organizations going on pilgrimage to the Israeli democratic movement. Go take missions to participate in the demonstrations. It will be among the most uplifting Zionist experiences you have ever had. Bring your congregants to democratic Israel. It's rising, and be part of this. And alternatively, have events in your synagogue hosting leaders of the democratic movement. Figure out ways where I'm not active on that level. I don't know what they need organizationally, but start adapting the movement. I would love to see big demonstrations happening outside of Israeli consulates in major American cities, not protesting against Israel, protesting for Israel, waving thousands of giant Israeli flags, just as we're doing in Israel. And standing up and saying, this is the Israel that we love and we are fighting for. We are not going to let this Israel go. And so that's what I would like to see. And there are demonstrations that are happening every week in New York, for example, in Washington Square Park, mostly Israelis, but some American Jews come. At one of the demonstrations the other week, they made a disastrous mistake. Somebody invited Peter Beinart to speak, which it just drove me out of my mind. Luckily he was booed off the stage. But this is not an anti-Israel protest movement. This is a pro-Israel movement. And so cashing in Israel bonds, I think that issue is kind of past already. You know, it was relevant when Smotrich was given a platform at Israel bonds. And I think that the protests that were held outside that event were really important. But I think this is a moment where the Israel-American Jewish relationship can be reaffirmed. And so let's see this as an opportunity and not just as a problem.
Thank you. We're going to turn away from the current issues at the moment, and because somebody had an interesting question. She lived in Jerusalem in 1977-78, and she said when Sadat came to Jerusalem, Shalom Akshav was organizing, and it felt like peace could happen. What are your thoughts about that as compared to 1967?
Well, about what are the chances for peace now?
They did not clarify. I think that she was asking about the chances for peace then, because while she was living there, she felt, everybody thought peace was going to happen and it did not. So how did that compare to the excitement and exhilaration of 1967? Well,
it's interesting because peace didn't happen in the way that many people hoped at the time as a comprehensive peace, but a kind of peace began with Sadat's visit, and is really, I think, took another major step with the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were really a fulfillment, in a way, of Sadat's promise of a warm peace, a peace of normalization, which did not happen with Egypt, and it didn't happen with Jordan, and obviously didn't happen in any form with the Palestinians. But it did begin to happen with parts of the Arab world. That peace is now at risk because of this extremist government. Nevertheless, I believe that the Abraham Accords will hold. I was in Morocco a couple of months ago. I went to tried to set up a program for the Hartman Institute to bring young Moroccan leaders to study Judaism and Israel at the Institute. And the reception was just fantastic. We have dozens of just terrific young people from various fields who want to come and study Israel at a Zionist institution in Jerusalem. So what the promise of 1977 really is to some extent taking shape now if this government doesn't act too irrationally on the Temple Mount, for example, and in other ways. My long-term hope for peace with the Palestinians is a regional peace, and that the Abraham Accords will be the foundation for eventually bringing the Palestinians in, because there is no bilateral peace agreement to be had between Israel and the Palestinians. We know each other's positions. There's not going to be any surprises there. But if you bring in the Arab world, including countries that we today regard as our allies, and just think about that for a moment, how extraordinary it is that Israel has Arab allies. What a revolution that is. And so I can, for the first time in the history of this conflict, as I've experienced it, imagine a scenario in which the Gulf states and if the Saudis can be brought back into the circle. Right now, they're starting to drift away. But there is a possibility, one can imagine a regional agreement that would bring the Palestinians in.
Thank you. So another interesting question, somebody asked, why are the Orthodox Jews now joining the demonstrations? What did they realize that they decided they wanted to participate?
Well, it's very much still a minority. I think that most of Israeli Orthodox Jews support this government. They're really the backbone, both in the Haredi sector, the ultra-Orthodox, and in the national religious camp. But there is a minority that's beginning to be vocally opposed. And I think that what some have come to realize is that this government, which speaks in the name of Orthodox Judaism, this is Israel's, in some ways, Israel's first Orthodox government. It's not entirely Orthodox, but it's either Orthodox or traditional aligned with Orthodoxy. Aside from Netanyahu, who loves to dine out at the world's least kosher restaurants, but plays the game. I think that the Orthodox opponents of this government realize that this government is desecrating the name of Judaism. It's not only threatening democracy and threatening our social cohesiveness. It's also, by speaking in the name of Judaism, it is a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name, of the name of Torah and Judaism. And I think you're starting to hear voices to that effect.
Thank you. So it's 9:10, and so we want to wrap it up now. I just have one more request from your friend Alan, and that is for you to please lead us in thinking about a future Israel united in appreciation of a Jewish state that is at peace with herself and her neighbors, that internalizes and embraces the others within and outside the Jewish community, and is indeed a light unto the nations that we all hope is its destiny.
Well, I think, Alan, you've just summed it up. That's exactly, if we get half of that, I think that it will be an extraordinary achievement, given the circumstances that Israel has to struggle against. And, you know, when I think about the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, if I could just say one thing about what I so deeply appreciate about Israeli democracy. Israeli democracy is not a paragon of kind of objective democracy. We never were, and I don't know if, given our circumstances, given the Middle East, given the nature of the security threats we face, I don't know that we can ever really be a paragon of democracy. There are other nations where you can see democratic norms being expressed much more fully than in Israel. But Israel's greatness, the greatness of Israeli democracy, is that we are a paragon of the struggle for democratic norms in impossible circumstances. Countries in our place would have long ago given up on democracy. The fact that we go through what we endure, we go from war to terrorism, back to war, back to terrorism. We haven't had a day of real peace in our 75 years that we're celebrating now. And what I celebrate about these 75 years is that we have never given up the struggle for decency. In the middle of this, we've never given up our aspiration for democratic norms. The struggle to try to mediate between Israel's security needs and objective democratic standards. That is what defines the greatness of Israeli democracy. And what we're fighting for now in Israel's 75th year is the ability to continue to maintain Israel as a paragon of the struggle for decency. And that's my hope, that's my prayer for the coming years, the coming months. So thank you all. Thank you for participating and for inviting me.
And I just want to say amen to what you said. And thank you very much for being with us tonight and giving your time and your insight. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill Schrag for the final closing.
Thank you, Yossi, very much. Thank you, Elizabeth, for moderating. Thank you, Jonathan Flaxer, not only for framing this evening's presentation, but for your leadership in the Jewish Literacy Committee that's presented 3 outstanding programs this year. And thank you to all of the lay and rabbinic members of that committee, as well as our professional staff. It's really a wonderful committee that's provided the community some outstanding programs. As Jonathan said earlier, please stay tuned for the fall when we enter into a partnership with SUNY Purchase for a program on Jewish music that will be followed in the winter on Jewish philosophy and ethics. Thank you to all 230 people who have joined in this evening's Zoom. And we've been given a lot to think about, both in terms of the anxiety that we felt in 1967 and over the last few months, and hopefully the euphoria that we felt after that war, and the sense of accomplishment that we hope will emerge from current negotiations. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. Have a good evening.
Thank you.